Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari, during his address at the United Nations General Assembly, called for debt cancellation for developing countries, noting that it poses severe challenges to the affected nations. President Buhari noted that the multifaceted challenges facing most developing countries have placed a debilitating chokehold on their fiscal space and calls for the need to address the burden of unsustainable external debt by global commitments to the expansion and extension of the debt service suspension initiative to countries facing fiscal and liquidity challenges. Now, joining us this morning is economic and political analyst Gbolahan Olojede to discuss this further. Good morning, Mr. Olojede. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Nice to be here.
When a lot of people saw, or heard, the statement from the president, it wasn't new because I think the vice president, Yemi Osinbajo, had made a similar statement, a few weeks ago, asking for debt cancellation and debt forgiveness. And of course saying that, the climate change moves by the poor African countries should be, the debt should be channeled into that instead, something like that. For you, did it sound like wishful thinking? Because at this point, Nigeria has currently our highest, debt figures that we've ever experienced. So did it sound like wishful thinking from the president?
Well, even if it was wishful thinking, the president still had to take a shot at it. If you never take a shot, you don't know what you might get. Now, our debt was sustainable some years ago, but things have continued to deteriorate as the budget deficit piles up.
Yes.
Yeah, and the revenues are not improving significantly. We've had to borrow to make up the gap, and this has become a burden. So we've seen a situation in which we have moved from using 50% of our revenue to service debt to 60 to 70 to 80 to 90%. Probably 100% to service debt. So definitely debt on Nigeria's neck has become like carrying a bag of sand on your back and trying to climb a mountain. So as the president, he needs to pitch for that. Whether he can get it, that's another case.
Now let's talk about if that is possible, because the former president Olusegun Obasanjo did,
Got
something that he has never been forgotten for, along with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala back then in his tenure. Do you think that's possible in 2022, bearing in mind that we're very likely going to have to borrow again to fund next year's budget?
You see, we do not qualify under there's something called HIPC, heavily indebted poor countries. And if you see the last list from the IMF World Bank, Nigeria did not make it. So you have Ghana, Zambia, Malawi, Chad, Benin, some other countries. That is because there are certain metrics that are used to determine if you qualify under the HIPC. And if you take a metric like debt to GDP, the debt to GDP of Nigeria is still very robust. But there is a problem. Nobody pays debt back from GDP. You pay it from the revenue. But the revenue has not improved significantly. So will Nigeria get it if we make a case that is strong enough that we are now, and it is easy to make. It is easy to make because everybody could see your numbers, how we might not have a capital budget in 2023 because of the debt burden. We will use all our money to service the debt, and there won't be anything to do capital projects. So you can use that to make a case. However, the real problem with Nigeria, which has remained revenue, has not been solved. So all these debt relief or debt cancellation, they come with their conditions. One of the 4 conditions of debt relief, for example, is your policy direction and policy implementation. So as a matter of fact, the people we are asking for debt cancellation from, they've been asking us to do a few things in the past.
Yes.
So if you go to them now, they're going to ask you for those things.
Yes.
They say unify your currency. They say remove fuel subsidy. So all those other things are conditions that they will put on the table.
Yes.
So are Nigerian decision makers ready to toe the line of these creditors? Because they are the creditors. They can say, we will do this, but you must do this in turn. It doesn't come free.
And it's probably a good time to mention the different economic management teams that the president has set up in the time that he's been there. And it's shocking because these teams always are made up with some of the finest brains well, hopefully some of the finest brains in the country.
Correct.
But it doesn't seem to have any effect. There's no implementation. There's no policy implementation. It doesn't seem like they actually even meet, and have any discussions. Something that you mentioned, and I'll read from an article. It says here, these loans are disbursed on the condition that the debtor countries adhere to the IMF's economic advice. It has become a recurring decimal as Bretton Woods institutions have advised the helmsmen of Nigeria to remove fuel subsidies that constitute a drain pipe on the resources of the nation, and has found itself with the undesirable status of being the poverty capital of the world. So I want you to respond to that. Remember, the president is talking about removing fuel subsidy next year.
Yes. We also heard that it was meant to be removed this year in line with the PIB. But because of the political exigencies, with the president postponing by 18 months, by that 18 months, he will no longer be the president. So the new guy has to deal with that trouble on his table. So these are the kind of policy issues that would determine whether you will get considered for debt relief under the IMF and World Bank. If they can't see those policy reforms, you're not going to get it. And it is what places countries like Ghana and those other ones in better light to get those kind of relief, because there have been a lot of policy reform issues in Ghana, in Malawi, and those guys are doing that. I'm not saying that aligning with the policies of this creditor is the best way to go. I am not I'm not pro IMF or World Bank.
Yes.
In fact, I am pro what can we do internally to improve the revenues. If the revenues of this country go up, because look at Nigeria. Nigeria has the largest GDP in Africa. How come South Africa, with a smaller GDP, is able to generate like 4 times our revenue for the federal government in South Africa? Though South Africa is also has its own major economic challenges out there. But it shows that Nigeria is unable to sweat its GDP. We're unable. It's like having an asset base in banking, and you are not able to create enough loan. You're not able to create enough assets to generate revenue. So Nigeria's GDP is just sitting there, and we're not turning it into government revenue.
More than $3 billion has been taken from China. These were meant to be used to build certain infrastructure.
Including the rails.
Yes, including the rails. Do you think President Muhammadu Buhari can go to Xi Jinping at this time and ask for debt relief? Will China give us any listening ear?
It is not impossible. You sit with him, you tell him your conditions. You see, the reschedule of debt, even in the private sector, these things happen all the time. Once you see the real status of your debtor, if you can't pay, you can't pay, unless you're hoping for a default. Otherwise, what you do is, okay, this debt is meant to be for 2 years. I will give you a moratorium, a breathing space of 6 months. Then I will extend this to 4 years. Those kind of things can happen. And it can happen with the Chinese loan, it can happen with the IMF loan. But it is not the ultimate thing to do. Why we do that to have some breathing space, we must fix the internal issues that are leading us in the direction of unsustainable borrowing. Because in the real sense, I know a lot of people don't like to hear this. What is 42 trillion naira debt to Nigeria? It's a tiny piece. South Africa has almost 3 times that amount. But you cannot continue to take up those debts if you don't fix your revenue problem. Because you're not going to repay debt from your GDP, you will repay it from revenue. So a situation in which if you take Nigeria's revenue today, and you take it 10 years ago, and you use the dollar rate 10 years ago and the dollar rate today, you'll be amazed that nothing much has changed in that revenue size. So we're not growing the revenues.
Final, I also want you to speak on, I always like to ask, would you say that the current government was overwhelmed or underprepared? And then you can also add, how much trouble is the next president in 2023?
I think the current government had so much goodwill when it came in, and a lot of these policy issues that we're talking about today could have been better handled than it did. There are no doubt that it had its own wins, but you see where it failed actually affected its wins. So if you failed in insecurity and you did train, and people cannot use those trains today because you didn't fix insecurity, that is a major issue. The next guy has a job cut out for him. Major policy issues he has to confront in the midst of high inflation, poor economic performance. How do you balance all of that? He has a huge job to do. He also still has insecurity to deal with. He has corruption issues to deal with. Today, Nigeria is probably the only oil country that is not making money when oil is in the $100 bracket. Yes. What are we doing? So the next guy, I'd better be ready.
Gbolahan Olojede, it's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for having me.
All right.